Welcome to From the Mind of Christine McConnell. We are back working on this vanity, and this next step is so detailed it really needed to be its own episode. That shadow box that goes in between those two nightstands, we are going to be doing a tufted liner on the inside. It's going to be so beautiful. I can't wait for you to see how this is done. So with that said, let's begin. The way we're going to begin this project is by measuring the width and the length of the surface we're going to be covering. And now I'm going to cut out a very thin board using those dimensions, and I'm actually going to make it just a tiny little bit smaller just because we are going to be covering this with fabric and you do want it to go in nice and flush. I'm using a jigsaw here to cut out these pieces, and just as a little side note, this is maybe one of my very favorite tools for cutting large pieces of wood, just because it really doesn't feel nearly as dangerous as so many other tools for cutting wood, especially like pieces that are a little bit larger. With a jigsaw, you have a little bit more control. Your lines may not be quite as perfect as something like a table saw, but you're less likely to have some gigantic blade come up and decapitate you. Now that all of our wood pieces are cut out, we need to design a diamond pattern. So the great thing about this technique is your diamond pattern can be as tall and narrow as you like, or as petite and small as you want. So the only thing that's going to be really, really key here is that it is consistent. So we're going to map out exactly what I feel like is perfect for this space, and we'll go from there. Something that I really love about creating one of these patterns is the math is so basic and simple, so you don't really have to be very good at math, and I'm certainly not, to create something like this. The one little note I will give you is you definitely want to create a diamond pattern. You don't want to create just a square, so always make sure that your height is longer than your width. Once you've created a grid that you're really happy with, now take your ruler and start drawing diagonal lines between the points. And then once you've done that, you'll know basically where your points are for your diamond pattern. After figuring it out on one of the smaller side panels, I just then carried over that pattern onto the larger sheet that's going to cover the bottom. All right, so now we have a diamond pattern that I'm really excited about. And the next step is to take some clear, transparent poster board. You can pick this up at Michael's in the poster board section. And what we're going to do is just lay this on top of the pattern we've created, mark our little dots, and then this way we can just punch out those little holes, place this onto the foam, and just repeat that pattern, and everything is going to be identical. To save myself a little bit of trouble, I'm going to tape both of these things together and then start drilling holes where all of those dots are. And this way, I'm just sort of saving myself a little time and trying to get as much done as quickly as possible. To create the puffiness we need for that tufted effect, I'm using this 2-inch foam squish. I don't think that's the correct term for this product, but you can find it at the back of the store at Joann Fabric. Something fun I discovered also while working with this stuff is that it cuts incredibly well with a very sharp bread knife. This is where that clear poster board really comes in handy, because you can just take a Sharpie and mark all of your placement for your dots. To hold the squish in place on your board, you just use a little bit of hot glue. It's now time to start covering our buttons, and I got one of these button making kits off of Amazon. I purchased them there because it was the only place that carried ones this small, and I'll leave the link to them below. A great little tip I can share with you right now is if you are ever making these really tiny buttons and you're using a thicker velvet or something like that to cover them, sometimes what they want to do is once you've assembled it, they can pop undone, which is not a great thing once you've gotten really far into the project. So something you can do to prevent that is once you put down that top button and the fabric, you can put a little dab of hot glue in there right before putting in the button back, and that should keep everything together, hopefully forever. Now it's time to start preparing the squish, and the way I'm going to do this is taking an X-Acto blade and cutting out small conical shapes around each of those dots. And then once I've completed that task, I'm going to take that same blade and start cutting in between the dots, essentially creating guidelines between each, and this just will give the fabric kind of somewhere to get tucked into once we affix it. Okay, so this next step is so incredibly important, so pay very close attention. So the pattern of the amount of fabric basically that you're going to be using over this board needs to be larger than what we originally designed. And the way you enlarge that pattern is you take a string and you mark it with a Sharpie, and you find one of your dots in the foam and you push it down all the way as far as you can possibly get it. Take the other side of the string, push it down as far as you possibly can go, and really kind of push as firmly as you need to. Pull that out and mark the string, and whatever that distance is how much bigger your pattern needs to be all over the place. And you might want to test this out by, experimenting with different dots. Make sure you've got a consistent sort of length there. Then once you've got that, you lay that down and just recreate basically that diamond pattern. So if you end up with like an additional, let's say 1/2 inch, that 1/2 inch needs to go from every other position. So you can test it just to make sure that it's going to be perfect and even. What I determined was that it was just about 1/2 inch larger between the dots. And so now I'm just recreating my grid with everything spaced 1/2 inch further apart. Once I had my pattern again, I took that poster board, that clear poster board, laid it on top of it and took a Sharpie and just remarked everything. And then from here, I'm actually going to be punching little holes where each of those little dots are, laying this on top of the fabric that I'm going to be using, and actually marking it with a disappearing ink pen. I'm now cutting out 10-inch lengths of this very sturdy cotton twine, and we're going to be using this to actually pull those buttons taut. So while I was working with this cotton twine, it just kept fraying out as I was trying to thread it through these needles. We tried some beeswax and it was difficult to work with. And then the captive actually had the idea to go run upstairs and grab some of his hair pomade, just the tiniest little bit, and it just made this project go so much smoother. So just a helpful little hint to you from the captive. All right, so I'm going to give you a little quick demo on how I'm preparing the fabric. So you just take a little bit of that thread that's been waxed with the pomade, put it through your needle, and you're going to just pierce that through. Make sure you get it. Let it loose from the needle. Take your button, weave it on there. And then once you've done that, you just get it back into your needle. And then when you go back in, leave about 1/8 of an inch gap between where you came out from where you're going back in. And this just ensures that everything is nice and sturdy. And it's not ever going to come apart on you. So that's how it should look. I'll be honest with you, this part is a touch tedious, but it does come and go pretty quickly, and when you're finished, it should look like this. The next step is to thread both of those strands through a very large needle and start working them into the holes that we pre-drilled. Once they are all placed and ready to go, you're going to flip this board over and start pulling each individual section as taut as you possibly can. And then once you've got it really, really nice and sturdy, you're going to start stapling it down. Once all of your staples are done, you can flip your board over and take all of the excess fabric that's in between the two dots and stuff it down into the slits that we cut. And when you're all done, it should hopefully look really close to King's Hawaiian bread. For something as small a scale as this, I liked the way this looked the most. Another way you could do this is if you didn't have those slits. If you notice, there's got kind of like a big chunk of fabric there. You can actually fold that over to create one seam, and that is technically how you typically create a tufted effect on a larger piece of furniture. Now we can start just trimming away any of those excess threads, and then once that's done, we're going to actually start pulling the edges of the fabric onto the back, stapling in a few places just to secure things, and then even in certain areas using a little bit of hot glue. The corners are really important, so you want to take a little bit of extra time to make sure you're folding them over and making them look as clean as possible before you pull out that staple gun and start permanently affixing them. Before we move on to the sides, let's make sure this fits nice and snug. And it's perfect. I'm now repeating that exact same process just on the side panels that are going to go around the edges. To seat this in place, I'm using a little bit of hot glue right there in the center and then pushing it very firmly into place. And then once this is completely done, I'm actually going to scooch one of the buttons in the center aside. From there, I'm going to be taking a brad nailer and just tacking that down just to ensure that that does not budge. Okay, our very last step is going to be applying the hardware. So I actually found these handles on a site that does reproduction pieces. So they look like, 1800s handles, and they weren't terribly pricey. That's sort of the big thing, is if you're trying to make a modern piece of furniture look old, is the hardware usually is like the tell that gives it away. So make sure if you're trying to make something look like it's an antique, that you're using the right hardware. Once I found the correct places for these, I'm going to be affixing them, but I'm also going to be removing them afterward and then just tinting them to kind of make them almost look like they may be a little bit rusted. To figure out the placement of where these handles are going to sit, I'm just taking a piece of paper and pushing it down here into the face of the drawer. From there, I'm going to cut out that shape, and then once I've done that, I'm going to mark where the original handles went, and then just sort of do the math a little bit to figure out exactly where these new handles are going to sit. Once I figured out the placement for all of these handles, I removed them, mixed a little bit of acrylic paint using red and yellow mainly, and then just started splotching it all over the exterior of the handle. Once that had been done, I took a paper towel and just sort of blotted off all of the highest points and surfaces. So the color that I added is just resting there in the cracks, really lending itself to an aged, kind of rusted look. Now to maintain continuity, I'm now going to line all of these drawers in that same velvet. To do this, we're basically mimicking what we did in that little shadow box thing where we just measure, the length and the width of the interior of the drawer and then cut out boards that are going to fit perfectly in here. Once we know it fits and we've sanded the edges, I'm now going to start cutting out some sections of batting that we're going to be using to add just a little bit of a puff underneath the velvet. Once we have our batting cut out and it's perfect, I'm going to use a hot glue gun to tack down just the corners so it doesn't sort of shift or move around once we apply the velvet. And then once that's done, we can actually lay the velvet on top, figure out our placement, and then begin stapling it down. The best way to make sure that everything is going to come together nice and evenly is to start stapling from the centers of all four sides and then just gradually working your way towards those corners. Now that everything is stapled down, it looks nice and even. We're going to finish up those corners, and then really we're just going to be laying this directly down into the drawer. We're not using any staples or adhesives, just in case we ever want to take this out and clean it. And finally, the last step we are going to tackle here is because we made this vanity out of 2 nightstands, those bottom doors open the same way, and we need to flip the door on the right-hand side around so that when you're sitting there in the center, it's easy to just open right there from the center and you can access everything easily. To slightly mask where that original lock was, we're going to take a little bit of stain and fill in all of that lighter color. We now need to transfer that lock to the opposite side. And initially when I did this, I marked it at the exact same height as it was on the opposite side. But what I didn't realize was that the lock on the door was originally a little bit higher from center. So I did all of this work and then realized I had messed up a little bit. So now I just have to recreate that same shape just a little bit below that. I'm now tinting this little section that we've chiseled away at before doing that final step of applying our last piece of hardware. All right, we're all finished and it's, oh my gosh, it just came out so incredible. It's my dream vanity and it's in a guest room that I won't be using it, but I'll just know it's there and it will make me happy. This was one of those projects that, like, if you were to go out and try to buy something like this, it would cost like $1 bazillion, I think. I don't even know. So it's kind of a really good argument for trying to figure out things yourself and make your own special heirloom pieces. So I hope you've enjoyed this. We've got still a whole bunch more coming. So in the meantime, take care of yourselves and I'll see you again very soon.